Okay, it's a pleasure to be here, so I'm very happy. Okay, so I will talk about a specific work, but it is true that my work in this area of PKI is quite broad. So I've been working on different aspects of PKI, including the usability aspects of PKI. I'll be happy to talk with you about different aspects of my work later on, but in this talk, I'm going to focus on a very specific topic, which is provable security for PKI, okay? Provable security for PKI. And that is joint work, as you can see, with students, Sarah Botniak, Chemi Leibovich, which is actually my ex-student, Eva Saita from Trinity College, and me, right? And this, okay, I hope this is not going to, oh, hide. Maybe I can get rid of this. Oh, excellent, excellent. Yeah, and it will be in CCS this year, hopefully, okay. Okay, so the first question you should be asking me, oh, by the way, if it is legit in this place, I welcome questions during the talk, okay? I know you guys are in Germany, so you are very polite, but try to overcome it. And when you have questions, do ask, okay? Thank you. Okay, so why do we study provably secure PKI, and especially why do we study it now? I mean, PKIs have been out there forever, right? This is, I assume everybody is familiar with PKI basic thing, right? Anyway, if not, I will explain in a moment. But anyway, believe me, they've been out there forever. Basically, every practical public key system is based on using PKI, public key infrastructure, right? Applied cryptography is basically based on certificates and public keys. There are many standards defining PKI systems. X509 and PKIX are the most well-known. Certificate transparency, which is doing some extensions to PKIX for web, mainly for web security, and many other for more specific stuff like RPKI4, which is used mainly for internet routing, SCMS, which is using for intelligent vehicle systems, and the DNSSEC, which is using for, which is DNS, obviously, SPKI, which is a proposal for different kind of way of doing a lot of standards and so on. And in addition, also, of course, many systems doing PKI and many proposals, a lot of things happen in this area in practice. But if you look at publications, actually, it's much more limited. And definitely, if you look at provably secure publications, which almost don't exist, I will mention here a bit, okay? Now, what we have in these, a lot of these PKI systems and so on, we actually have seen quite a lot of failures of PKI systems, as well as new requirements, some of them derived from the failures observed in the wild of PKI systems. So people have tried to improve, introduce new requirements, and also because of different applications. So we have new requirements. We have observation about scalability challenges of all the PKI systems. All of that motivate improved PKIs, and the improved PKIs are also more complex, so significantly more complex. And I think when we ask, why do we do provably secure PKI only now? Part of the reason, I think, is that the very early PKI systems were very simple, and their security properties were pretty trivial. And they also followed pretty trivially from signature schemes. So there was no, people, I guess, did not feel the need to define their security goals and prove them, right? But now with these much more complex PKI systems, it's not the case anymore. You have things like certificate change, which is very basic already in PKI, revocation, multiple revocation mechanisms. We actually still have in practical cryptography, we still have some problem in finding the right revocation solution. Transparency, which is what certificate transparency is about, privacy, anonymity, blockchains, a lot of additional complexity in the design, in the goals, and so on, which already require us to have good security requirements and analysis. So there have been few efforts of provable secure PKI. Here I wrote the 3 works which we have found in this area. But all of these 3 works are really focusing on the most basic PKI systems. So, which is far not sufficient for the real PKI systems in use, and definitely not the proposed. So what we set up to do is to define the secure PKI systems, and or even define what's a certificate, and that's what we are going to talk about. And the challenge that we met very early on in this work is that these many different PKI systems, they have a lot of different models and assumptions and requirements. So, which makes the classical ways of defining security made it challenging or infeasible for us to use. So we looked at defining them with UC, we looked at doing game-based, but we actually had to introduce a new framework, which we did, which I'll talk about a bit. This is the most modular security specification framework, which is what we use to do these specifications, okay? So I'll talk about that a bit, okay? But let's begin with just putting us on the solid ground. What do we mean by a PKI scheme and by a certificate? First, a certificate, and here I'm still very intuitive. Later I'll make it a bit more precise, but intuitively it's very simple. A certificate is a signed encoding, signed statement, which encodes a set of name-value fields. So we have a field like a subject field, an issuer field, a validity period, from and to, and many times we'll have a public key. When we have a public key, we'll call it a public key certificate, yes, but not necessarily, not all certificates necessarily have to have a public key or any other field in principle, okay? So basically, think of a certificate as a signed encoding of a set of fields, okay? Now, what is a PKI scheme? It's a scheme, like all other cryptographic schemes, a set of algorithms for establishing trust in keys via certificates. So usually it will be keys in certificates, or establish the trust in the keys or in the certificates which contain the keys. So it will have operations like certify, which is producing a new certificate by an entity which we call, people call the issuer or the certificate authority, to revoke a certificate by the issuer, to validate a certificate by parties which are relying on the certificate, so we call them the relying parties. For example, the browser, your browser connecting to a website, so the website sending certificate, the browser checking it, relying on it. And to validate the certificate, we use some set of certificates, which is our trust anchors. That is what we can use as the basics to establish the trust. We call it certificate, root certificate store or trust anchor. And we also use typically, in addition to the certificate itself, some auxiliary information like certificate chains or revocation information like certificate revocation list or other to validate the certificate, okay? And certificate transparency, one of the extensions that I mentioned, also adds functions like logging certificates, monitoring them, and auditing them. Okay, so a PKI could have additional functions. That's basically what I'm trying to say. But these are the certify, revoke, and validate are probably the most basic functions. Now, I mentioned certificate chains, so let me explain a bit, again, to give us a solid basis. How do we validate certificates in PKIX and many PKIs? A classical validation of certificate using a certificate chain. So what is this certificate chain? So certificate chains comes to deal with the reality that usually we have this certificate store of these trusted certificates, trusted entities, basically, like root certificates, but we want to have, not all certificates will be issued directly by one of these trusted entities. Many of them will be issued by secondary certificate authorities or issuers. Here, for example, we have a typical scenario. So we have some certificate in the store, some root CA, which issues certificate to some intermediary CA, which issues a certificate to an NCA, which then issues certificate to a subject, which is a website like www.bob.com. And to validate, to establish a secure communication, the website will be sending to the client, it will be sending this certificate chain, Psi0, which it got from the NCA, Psi1, which is a certificate the NCA got from the intermediate CA, and Psi2, which the intermediate CA got from the root CA. So you see, whenever you provide the certificate, you may need to provide the chain so that when the entire chain is sent, we have the entire chain connecting to a certificate in the root store. Okay, so that is a typical way that allows us to validate certificate of www.bob.com using the certificate we have in the store. So we'll verify this entire chain of relationship. We verify that using the public key of certificate I+1, the higher public key, we check the signature over the next certificate. So we check each of them, and also we check that the issuer of certificate I is the subject of certificate I+1. So each certificate, like certificate 1, is indicating who is the issuer, or that is signing certificate psi 0. So he's saying, okay, the issue of psi 0, I'm going to tell you its public key, so you'll be able to verify psi 0. So the www.bob.com is able to issue certificate psi 0 to sign, or in this case, actually, the NCA is issuing certificate psi 0 to the subject here. And to verify it, you can use the information in psi 1, which the intermediate CA has put the name of the NCA and the public key of the NCA. In that way, you can verify the entire chain. Okay, so that gives us some intuition, some background. And now let's try to, and then of course, this is a simplification also for, in particular, I did not talk about the revocation stuff. So each certificate in the chain should also come with valid certification, revocation information, like a certificate revocation list or something, CRL or some other mechanism to know they are not revoked. Okay, so now that we got some basic, let's try to begin to define the basic properties, okay? And in this work, we've tried to identify the main properties to define them. Certainly, it is quite likely that additional properties we have missed and should be defined, or this definition should be improved and so on. This is really just beginning of trying to come up with definitions that will be useful for the entire community for what is a secure PKI, security property for PKI. So let's try to first talk about them very informally, okay? First property is unforgeability. This is similar to unforgeability of signature schemes, but it extends it to this PKI. So if we have a certificate, psi 0, which is valid, and the issuer is benign, basically what we expect from such a situation, if you have a certificate which is valid and the issuer is benign, you would expect that the issuer has actually certified this certificate, right? So this is indeed one option. And this is similar to a signature scheme, right? If you have a message and its signature and it's valid, you expect that the signature was actually produced by the signing party, by the owner of the private key. But here in PKI, this is just one option. What is the other option is this OR here. So option 1, the issuer is certified, psi 0. Option 2, we can find a valid fraudulent public key certificate, psi 1, which such as the psi 1 subject is psi 0 issuer. So that is the other option. The other option is that we have a fake certificate, a fraudulent certificate, to the issuer, which means that we could have been misled about the issuer. And then we use the wrong public key for the issuer, maybe known to an attacker, and then the attacker could have issued the certificate as if it was, and we thought it is by the issuer. So that is something that could happen in a PKI because we establish trust in the issuer by the certificate of the issuer itself. So it could happen. So we define this fraudulent public key certificate. The public key certificate psi is fraudulent if, should be psi 1, sorry. If public key certificate psi 1, ignore the fact we don't have the 1 here, okay? Psi 1 is fraudulent if psi 1 public key was not self-certified by psi 1 subject. Yes?
I think we have a mild technical problem because Zoom just shows me the first slide. It just shows me provable security for public key and structure.
Okay.
Following you, I think, because you shared it with the app, with another.
But so.
Share your screen with the Zoom, but with this.
So let's see the Zoom here. Here's the Zoom. Oh, what do we do? Do you want to stop sharing and reshare maybe? Okay, let's try to do that. But I'm not sure it will work. Okay, stop sharing, share.
Share again the presentation, maybe.
But I don't have this window now. Oh, I know what happens. Window. Yes, let's try to share this one. Do you get it now? No, it's not perfect, but let's see if I can do F11 to get full screen, because let's see if it will work after I've done it. Did I press the wrong button? Yeah. Does it still work for you over there? Does it still work or not?
I don't have full screen. Let's see the.
No, if it's not, it probably doesn't change, right?
No.
Okay, so I guess we'll just have to do without full screen. Okay, we'll just do it like this, okay? I don't see any other option if we want, because Zoom is not, not smart enough to get it if it's, I don't think we have another option. Okay, it's not terrible, right? We just survive like this. Okay. And now you can laugh at me for having so many tabs open at the same time. Okay. I'm sure you guys are organized and you never have like 20 tabs like me. Okay. Okay, so never mind. So we're talking about fraudulent certificate. So a certificate is fraudulent if the public key of the certificate was not self-certified by the entity. Now, what is self-certified basically means that this entity is saying this is my private key, right? And we remember that we are really talking here about a benign entity, right? So the idea is that a benign entity would declare the keys that it actually used for its own, that it's self-generated, right? So if it has a key, if it uses the key in a legit way, it would self-certify it, okay? And if you have a key, a certificate, and the entity did not self-certify, that means that it's actually have not been generated by that entity, or that this entity is not benign. Anyway, something is bad with this certificate. We shouldn't use it, right? Okay, so therefore, unforgeability basically says either the entity really, a benign entity really has issued a certificate, or we have this fraudulent key for the issuer. So we were misled as to what is the key of the issuer. Okay. Maybe do it like this. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I'll try to survive. Second property is accountability. Accountability says if we are giving a valid, again, a valid public key certificate, a valid certificate, not a public key, psi 0, we can find a root certificate, psi r in the store, which is accountable. Accountable either for that certificate or or for some valid certificate which is a bad certificate. Either its subject is corrupt or it is this fraudulent public key certificate like we discussed above. So what does it mean to be accountable for a certificate to be accountable for another certificate? If psi is accountable for psi prime, if the subject have certified psi prime, that's the first option. So if you have certified the certificate, of course you're accountable for it. Yeah, you have kind of authorized it, yes. Or another option, if the subject has certified another certificate that is accountable for this psi prime. So you don't have to be, the first option is basically directly accountable. So if you have issued that certificate and you're accountable for it. The other option is if you have certified the certificate, that certificate was accountable for the end certificate. So if you're like a root CA and you have issued intermediate CA and which is issued an end CA, you're still accountable for this entire chain, basically. And what we want is the accountability to be accountability of one of the root CAs. Why? Because basically, technically, what can we do when the party is accountable and is actually misbehaving, right? If you have a certificate which is problematic in some way, okay? So you want to do something about it. What you could always do is say, if I identify an accountable root CA, I can remove the root CA. I can say I don't trust them anymore. For other certificates, maybe the entity you will never find them. Maybe they're in a country you cannot even go to court against them, right? You don't know. They are just, but they have been approved by somebody. So if I've been damaged, I want to have somebody basically I can punish for my damages. I can, require them to compensate me or what? Or I will remove them from my trust store. I will not trust them anymore. okay? So at least we have some measure against them. So that's the basic accountability we can hope to have in a PKI, okay? That's, of course, very informal so far. So we will try to make it a bit more formal, but first, two other properties, revocation. So we have a certificate which is valid, yeah?
Sorry, the problem is still persisting, and I
Oh.
think maybe it will work out if you share the whole screen instead of just this window.
Oh, we can try to do that. Let's try to do that. Okay, okay, stop sharing, but usually it doesn't have this weird problem. But I am showing entire screen, I think. Okay. Oh, I know. Yeah, you're right. You're right. I did. This is not what I showed before. Okay, let's try to show the entire screen. And now we are showing the entire screen. We can try to also. So let's first see. Does it work now? Does it change?
Yes.
Okay, that's option number one. Option number two, let's try to see full screen. Maybe it will work this time. Yes. Does it work? It works. Oh, perfect. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Sorry about all of that. So delta revocation. So a certificate, if a certificate is valid, again, at some time t, now we are talking at the time, and the issuer of the certificate is benign, then the issuer did not revoke the certificate before t minus delta. That is basically if a benign issuer is revoking a certificate, then the certificate should become invalid. After, okay, not immediately, but after some maximal time delta. Makes sense, right? This is, I think, wouldn't you say this is the natural requirement for revocation? As we will talk later, actually, I'll talk briefly about revocation. So actually, yes, this is a natural requirement, but actually it turns out that the standard PKIs don't really achieve this property. So we had to define some variant of it in order to show what the PKIs actually achieve. Although it's completely achievable. It's not like you cannot achieve it, okay? But it's actually not achieved currently with the current PKIs. Okay, last property is transparency. That's really relevant only to PKIs which are trying to achieve transparency, like certificate transparency, right? If a certificate is valid at some time t, then it is included in a public log by t plus delta. So it's a bit similar to revocation. It's a timing-based property. It says after some delta time, my certificate will be known to everybody, okay? To these public logs. Oh, wait a moment, let me hide this. Yes. Now, to rigorously define these properties, because this is very informal, right? And we cannot prove stuff with such definition. They are very informal. To be able to actually define them formally and then analyze if they are holding or not, we had to, as I mentioned, we just had to basically develop this framework, which is the same set of authors. We've developed it. So we actually began proving PKI, but since we couldn't do specifications properly, maybe somebody smarter can do them in UC or whatever, right? I'm just saying we failed to do it. So we ended up defining these modular security specifications, okay, which was in Crypto 21. Okay. So how do we define requirements using this MOS, okay? So we define requirements using predicates, simple algorithms, right? Predicates over a transcript of an execution. So the transcript is defined by this exec function or algorithm. There's a specific algorithm we call exec, execution process, which gets us an input like an oracle, if you want, of the adversary algorithm A and some protocol algorithm P, and then it defines an execution of them. Of course, it's probabilistically and so on. Yes, it's not deterministic, it's probabilistic, but still it defines a specific execution of them. And this is the, I'm not presenting the pseudocode. It's not very complex. Pseudocode is not very complex, but I mean, I want to talk about PKI, so it will still take us time. But I will just go over the high level of how it works. But it's really a pretty simple algorithm. So this execution process, and a fixed algorithm for every protocol, okay? So how does it work? The concept is that this execution process will be invoking the algorithm for the parties and the algorithm for the adversary by keeping the state used by these algorithms inside the execution process. So first you initialize the adversary, and the adversary in particular tells you how many parties you want to have. You give it You give the adversary the parameters, it gives you back number of parties and an initial state for the adversary. And then you initialize the parties. So you invoke the protocol in each party. And each of these parties is initialized, yes? And now you have this loop. In the loop, you ask the adversary, okay, here's your state. What do you want next to happen? Adversary tells you, oh, invoke this entity, ent is for the entity, with this operation, with these inputs, and also the time. Time is very important here in practical systems, basically. Time is very important. So we give the time actually in two different ways. We give one value we call clock, one value we call tau. Why? Well, of course, one advantage is to confuse everybody, but another advantage in doing it is that we have one time which is the real time, that's tau, and one time which is the clock time of the entity. And the clock time of the entity does not have to be the precise real time. So we can support different models of clock synchronization in this way, okay? So adversary is giving all of these values, and then the execution simply invokes that party. Invokes the party with the operation, with the input, and with its own state. So the adversary does not get to see the state of the entities, okay? Just the state of itself. And the input and the clock, not the real time. Real time parties don't get. And then the parties give the new state of the entity and the output. They provide the output for this round. And then we go back to the adversary. We say, okay, adversary, here's your state. Here's what the party has output. We have a special way that in this talk, I don't need to even discuss it. How do we handle confidentiality? So I will skip confidentiality for this presentation because for the PKI now, we don't use confidentiality. So I can skip that part, but we do support it in most, but I will skip how we do it, okay? And then we give to the adversary the output of the entities and the state of the adversary. The adversary tells us its new state, its own output, and its output is also telling us, did we finish the execution or not? If we finish the execution, we just put the transcript of all the operations that happened during the execution, which party was invoked in which step, each step, which party was invoked, what was the input, what was the operation, what was the output, and so on. If the adversary says, no, I want to continue, then we just go back and ask him for instructions and again, do it again and again until the adversary tells us, I'm done, okay? Now that is kind of a game, which is a kind of a generic game, which we can use for completely different protocols, completely different requirements, because we define the requirements by predicates over this transcript, as I will show you right now, okay? So basically, that's the idea. It's a fixed game, basically, which allows you to play many games, right? There are these kind of board games, right? Which you can do. I mean, like a computer is basically, that's what it is. For most of the people in the world, a computer is nothing but a machine to play many games, right? So this is a machine to play many games, okay? Okay, so now we'll define requirements in the most style. So a protocol P satisfies requirement. And for simplicity, again, there are a few very small things in most that I'm skipping. So that's why I'm talking about the requirement predicate pi r. In most, there's a bit more, but never mind that. You will ask me later if you're interested, or you read the paper, even better. Okay, so a protocol pi satisfies requirement predicate pi r potentially under some model, but we'll talk about the model soon. But if you have a bit of intuition, the model will be restrictions on the capabilities of the adversary, like an adversary model, right? Except that our adversary is not just a regular adversary that you may think about an attacker. Our adversary also includes stuff like clock synchronization, you know, the time and messages and everything. Everything basically is adversarial in a sense, and until you restrict it using a model. So we'll talk about a model soon. You can restrict the adversary by a model. Okay. So a protocol satisfies requirement predicate pi r, potentially under some model M, if for every adversary that satisfies that model, as I said, it is bounded by these restrictions, the predicate applied to the output of the execution holds with overwhelming probability in the length of the parameters. Okay? So that is how we define a requirement. A protocol will satisfy a requirement if basically for every adversary that is under the model, right, satisfies the model, the execution almost always returns that the adversary did not succeed to output a win execution. Basically, you think the adversary is trying in this execution is trying to cause a transcript which you say the protocol failed and I want the adversary. And we are saying the protocol is secure, is satisfying the requirement if the adversary cannot do it. If almost always the executions end and the adversary just has to give up. Okay. So let's talk now about try to use it for PKI requirements. Begin with the existential unforgeability. First, I just basically repeat the general definition of a requirement for the specific case of existential unforgeability. So a protocol satisfies existential unforgeability under some model if for every polynomial time adversary, the probability that the predicate of existential unforgeability, which I'll show in a moment, will hold is overwhelmingly close to 1, okay? Where T is the result of the transcript of the execution, and the adversary satisfies the model. Now, informally, that's basically what we had before. I'm just making it a bit more colorful here, right? Because I will map it to the predicate. So first I present it informally, and then I present actually the predicate, okay? Informally, the predicate is failed, that is, the adversary actually wins if the adversary is outputting this certificate, time, store, and auxiliary. So the certificate is valid with psi 0 is valid with the benign issuer, but wasn't certified by the issuer, by this benign issuer, and there is no valid fraudulent certificate. There is no valid certificate psi 1 for, oops, excuse me, didn't notice this. What is more amazing is that Sarah is very careful and she didn't notice it either. Anyway, that certificate 0 issuer, we don't have a fraudulent certificate for the issuer, that is certificate with the issuer of that certificate being the subject of this, of psi 1, where the subject did not self-certify the public key. So that is what we also talked before, this case where, yes, you got a forged, you got this certificate, but and the issuer did not actually certify it, but that is because you actually have this other certificate to the issuer, which is fraudulent itself. Okay, so now basically that's why your unforgeability failed. And now let me show you the pseudocode or the predicate itself. So you see, this is really pretty simple pseudocode, right? For which exactly says what we said before using this MOS methodology. So it's just a predicate, a function, which is applied to the transcript of the execution, T. Oops. Going back, yes. Transcript of the execution. First operation is that the adversary, we take from the transcript the output of the adversary, and we look for it should be these 4 elements, the certificate, the time, the store, and the auxiliary. And now we check if the certificate is valid. First of all, it has to be valid, right? And it was not certified, and the issuer is benign. I hope you know that most of you are not colorblind, and therefore you can map the colors to these things. Okay, but basically we're mapping it. So it's benign issuer. So the issuer is now Tn is the set of all entities. Tf is the faulty entities. So if Tn minus Tf are the benign entities, that's all. So this is a complex way of just referring to the benign entities in the execution, right? And then what should happen is, so it was not certified properly by the issuer, but what should happen is that for the adversary to win, there is no certificate psi 1, which is now, this is what is PV cert, this PV cert that I'm writing here, okay? You see it? So PV cert is another function of the PKI, which is basically, it's a function which gets the same inputs as the verification, the validate function. So if the certificate is valid, then we can apply vcert to the same inputs as to the verify function, and we get back a set of certificates which were basically used in the validation, in the verification. Some set of certificates. Now that's of course a PKI specific implementation, right? Every PKI should have this function if we want to be able to have these properties. And now the adversary has to ensure that there will be no certificate in this set, which is this fraudulent certificate. We said that we'll find the fraudulent certificate. So we look in this set and we see, do we have a certificate so that this certificate is valid, and yet the public key of the certificate was not issued by the subject. So this is the fraudulent certificate we talked before. If we can find such a fraudulent certificate, that's unforgeability is still holding, right? The existential unforgeability is still holding. Okay, so if adversary succeeded in all of that, we return bottom. Otherwise, we return true, and that's basically the entire predicate. Similarly, we can define the accountability requirement. Yeah, it takes me a bit longer. Yeah, accountability requirement, which says a certificate said a PKI satisfies accountability. If given a valid certificate psi 0, we can find a root certificate psi r in the store, which is accountable either for psi 0 or for a valid bad certificate psi 1, which means either the subject is corrupt, so it's an entity with a bad subject and a certificate you issued to a bad subject, or the public key of the certificate was not self-certified by the subject. So it is a fraudulent public key certificate. And again, we can define, or we define a predicate by a pseudocode. We give the pseudocode of the predicate. So it's very similar. You have this predicate, and adversary has to output the same things as before. And if this certificate is not valid, or if there is a certificate in the store which is accountable for it, or if there is a certificate in the store which is accountable to one of these bad certificates. So it's some certificate psi prime that is accountable for the psi r, the certificate in the store is accountable for it, and it is, of course, has to be valid, and the subject is of the psi prime is bad, or the subject did not self-certify the public key. So that's like this bad certificate. So if we have accountability, if we can find a root CA which is accountable either for the original certificate or for some of these kind of bad certificates, so we can blame this entity, this root entity. And notice that you may say, but maybe this you have this, I'm accountable for something bad, but it has nothing to do with this bad certificates that you have found, that you want to look for who is accountable for it. But then, if really it has nothing to do with it, the attacker should have been able to do an execution in which we will not be able to find it. So somehow the attacker has had to use this bad certificate to issue whatever certificate we are looking who is accountable. Okay, so the basic property we're going to show is that C, if C is a secure certificate scheme, and the PKI is either PKIX, which is using this certificate scheme, or CT, which is using this certificate scheme in a hash function, then P is satisfying unforgeability and accountability under this model of initialization and of failures. But here there are a few things which I didn't define here in this theorem. First, about this model that I mentioned now of initialization and of failures. What is this model? So first, how do we define a model, basically? What does it mean for an adversary to satisfy a model? So a model is restricting the capabilities of the adversary. So the adversary satisfies the model predicate pi m if for every protocol, so now the qualifiers over the protocols, for every protocol, the probability of this predicate in not holding for the execution, for the transcript of the execution of the adversary with the protocol is almost 1. So the model should always hold, almost always hold, for executions of the adversary with any protocol, okay? So basically, this will be restricting the adversary in some way, the operation of the adversary in executions with every protocol. So that allows us to have a lot of different models restricting the adversary in different ways. So in particular, we have this corruption of entities, and most actually supports in the execution process 3 ways of corrupting entities. You can do get state to get the state of the entity. You can do set output to force a specific output of the entity. And you could do set state to decide force a state of the entity. So we support these three ways. Models can restrict these corruptions. In particular, this PyMF model simply requires the adversary to identify in its special output TF the set of corrupted entities. Now, how do we formalize this? It's actually pretty simple. This is this simple predicate. So the predicate says, I get the transcript, I get the parameters, and I return true if for every event, either the entity in the event is in this set of faulty entities, or the operation in this event is not one of these fault operations. So that is a simple example of a model which restricts the adversary or what the adversary can do. We could also restrict the adversary to not corrupt more than a certain number of entities. I mean, it's very flexible. You can restrict the adversary in many ways. You can restrict clock, you can have a clock synchronization model where you restrict the adversary that the clock of the party is the same as the real-time clock or is not too different from real-time clock and so on. Many different models. Okay. So we have now this theorem that we discussed, and now we discuss what is this model, or at least I discussed one of them, the MF. The MINIT is also a very simple model of initialization of the parties. You initialize them correctly. So this is just a conjunction of these two models. But let me talk about another thing which I didn't explain. What is this C, secure certificate scheme here? So what is this C that I mentioned here? Because this is not something I think that you're familiar with. What is a certificate scheme at all? So in reality, PKIs in practice, they use different encodings of these fields in the signed, in the certificates. There are many different encodings for all these different fields. And even in the same standard like PKIX, there are different encodings for different fields. So not all the fields are actually encoded in the same way. There are even different encoding. Some are in an extension, some are in a field within the extension, some are in a basic field. There are many of these, many even different ways of encoding fields. And then also the different encoding mechanisms. It's very inconvenient or almost impractical to analyze the PKIs, these practical PKIs, if I give explicitly all of these details of the encodings, because there are so many, and I do want to do reduction directly for a signature scheme, it will be almost hopeless. So what we ended up finding to do is the idea was to specify and to analyze using an abstract scheme, which we call certificate scheme. Now, this is a very simple extension of a signature scheme. So a certificate scheme is basically just like a signature scheme. It's key generation, certify and verify. Certify is like sign, verify, and extract. Just one new function called extract. The certify receives a set of name value pairs and a signing key, and it outputs a certificate. As we said, a signature basically over a set of name value pairs. And we can now define existential unforgeability just like for signatures, very similar. It is very similar. And we even show a generic construction of a provably existential unforgeable certificate scheme from any existential unforgeable signature scheme and any invertible encoding scheme. So what you basically, it boils out to, that you need to do is to show that your encoding scheme is invertible, which is pretty simple. I mean, that's an obvious goal of all of these encoding schemes is for them to be invertible. And then you just use any secure signature scheme and you have a secure certificate scheme. And this is actually useful beyond public key certificates. It's useful for things used in PKIs themselves, like CRLs and STH. They use for things which are used in applications of PKI, basically like ROAs. It's used in DNSX, so it's very useful, actually. So now this theorem should be pretty well defined. How do we prove these properties? Unforgeability is basically just a reduction to the unforgeability of the certificate scheme. And for the accountability, it's also a reduction, but it basically follows the validation process for certificates and certificate chains defined in the RFC. So that's basically what I'm planning to show you today. So let me see. Yeah, I'm pretty much on time. What is beyond that? So there's a lot in the work beyond that. We defined these two different notions of revocation: guaranteed revocation and accountable revocation. Guaranteed revocation is basically the intuitive definition that we said at the beginning, that if a benign entity revokes a certificate, after some time, bounded time, it will just not be valid anymore. That's what you would expect. But actually, PKIX and CT also just support accountable revocation, which is a bit weaker notion, in which if a certificate remains valid, even though it was revoked, it remains valid for somebody, then we can identify who is accountable for it. So again, something is basically the accountability approach. In particular, we can identify the accountable root CA that has certified the entity which has caused this to be possible. Basically, it's an attack, right? Okay, and then we have a theorem which shows that PKIs and CT ensure accountable delta revocation under this model, which is, okay, this is the failures, this is the initialization, and here we have clock drift. So that exactly is a model which says that your clocks are within bounded distance of real time. So it's not guaranteed, and we have this counterexample showing that actually PKIX does not ensure the stronger the guaranteed revocation, although there is something in the RFC which shows that they kind of try to achieve it, apparently, but it does not achieve this property. I did not even define it, okay? So then we also have another theorem that shows that certificate transparency ensures also honest logger transparency, and a variant of it, which is we call CT with audit, which is a variant that Google is in the Chrome browser. When you install it, you have an option which basically translates to whether your CT implementation in the browser will be the classical CT or the CT with audit. If you do the CT with audit, then it ensures a bit stronger version, which is audited delta transparency. Both of these will be ensured only under this model, which is, again, the failures, the initialization, the clock drift, and also the communication, bounded communication delay, and also bounded wake up. So an entity can ask to be woken up at some time, and it would be, adversary will have to wake it up within delta of the time it requested, okay? So we need all of these, we think we need all of these models. And note that CT with audit is problematic for privacy. We didn't define yet privacy as a requirement, but this is surely a problem, and such a requirement could be defined. We just didn't yet do it. Should be defined even, I would say, but we didn't do it. Yeah, and then we also have a counterexample shows the CT fails transparency if the loggers can be corrupt. So future work, there is a lot of future work to do. There are other PKIs to analyze, and indeed, one of the reasons we are doing it is to be able to prove analyze security for improved PKIs. We are working on an improved PKIs ourselves. There are additional requirements. I mentioned already privacy. That's one that should be defined and ensured. And in MOST, we actually, the original work of MOST did not allow for composition, that is modular design of algorithms, but now we've been working on that, and now we have a new version which does support compositions. And another challenge with MOST is to use tools of verification, which is still a big challenge, but we hope that this will also be done at some point. Yeah, okay, that's it. Thank you very much.